He moved slowly through the checkpoint, scanning bags with tired eyes, his hands steady but unhurried. Passengers huffed behind him, checking their watches, muttering under their breath. "Can you move any slower?" one businessman snapped. The old man didn't respond. He never did. He just kept working, one bag at a time, one passenger at a time. Most people saw him as nothing more than an obstacle between them and their gate. But one pilot, waiting in line for a random security check, saw something different. Something that made him freeze mid-step and stand at attention in the middle of a crowded airport terminal. What happened next would remind an entire airport that some people carry history in silence. And sometimes, all it takes is one person paying attention to change everything. Before we dive into this story of patience, sacrifice, and forgotten valor, tell me in the comments from which city are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. These moments matter more than you know. The airport security checkpoint opened at 4:30 a.m. every day. And every day, at exactly 4:15, he was already there. His name was Walter Hayes, 72 years old. Gray hair cropped short, thin frame glasses that sat low on his nose. He wore the standard TSA uniform, navy blue polo, black pants, black shoes polished but worn. No jewelry, no watch, just a small name tag clipped to his chest that read, W. Hayes, Security Officer. He never spoke unless spoken to. Never smiled unless someone smiled first. And even then, it was brief. A nod, a quiet, have a safe flight. That was it. The other TSA agents were younger, faster, louder. They joked with each other between shifts, complained about management, scrolled their phones during breaks. Walter didn't do any of that. He just worked, steady, methodical, unbothered by the chaos around him. Passengers barely looked at him. To them, he was just another face in a long line of inconveniences. Another uniform, another delay, and on busy mornings, when lines stretched back past the ticket counters, they let him know it. "Come on, old man, we've got places to be. Can someone else take over? This guy's taking forever. Seriously, I'm gonna miss my flight because of this." Walter never responded. He just kept scanning, kept checking, kept doing his job the way he'd been trained to do it, carefully, thoroughly, without shortcuts. Most of his co-workers didn't know much about him. They knew he lived alone, never talked about family, never mentioned kids or grandkids, never went to the company holiday parties or the after-work gatherings at the bar down the street. He was polite, but distant, present, but somehow separate. One of the younger agents, a woman named Jessica who'd been working there for 3 years, once asked him if he had plans for Thanksgiving. Walter had looked at her for a moment, as if weighing whether to answer, and then simply said, "Not really." She tried to invite him to her family's dinner, but he declined with a quiet smile and a "thank you, but I'm fine." After that, people stopped asking. They assumed he preferred to be alone. And maybe he did. Or maybe he'd just gotten used to it. But on this particular Tuesday morning, something different happened. The checkpoint was packed. Spring break travel rush. Families with strollers, business travelers with laptops, college kids with oversized backpacks. Everyone in a hurry. Everyone stressed. And Walter was working lane 3, the one closest to the wall, the slowest lane by design. A man in his mid-30s, wearing a sharp gray suit and carrying a leather briefcase, stepped up to the conveyor belt. He was already annoyed. He glanced at Walter, then at his watch, then back at Walter. "You gonna scan that today or tomorrow?" the man said, not quite joking. Walter didn't look up. He just pulled the man's bag through the scanner, examined the screen, and waved him forward. The man grabbed his bag with a huff and walked off, muttering something about government employees. Behind him, a woman with 2 kids, then a college student, then an elderly couple, all of them impatient, all of them frustrated, none of them seeing the man in front of them as anything more than an inconvenience. Walter had worked this job for 12 years. 12 years of early mornings, of rushed passengers, of complaints and eye rolls and passive-aggressive sighs. He'd heard it all, being called everything from lazy to incompetent to worse. And he'd never once defended himself, never once explained who he was or what he'd done before this job. Because it didn't matter. Not to them. And honestly, not to him either. He wasn't looking for recognition. He wasn't looking for respect. He was just looking for steady work, decent benefits, and a reason to wake up in the morning. This job gave him that. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't exciting, but it was enough. At least, that's what he told himself. But then, at 7:42 a.m., Captain David Marsh stepped into the line. Captain Marsh was a commercial airline pilot, 23 years with Delta. He'd flown 737s, A320s, even a few international routes on the 777. He was scheduled to fly to Atlanta in 2 hours, but he'd been randomly selected for an additional security screening. It happened sometimes. He didn't mind. He knew the drill. He placed his bag on the belt, removed his shoes, emptied his pockets. Then he stepped forward and waited while Walter scanned his belongings. At first, Marsh didn't pay much attention. He was scrolling his phone, checking the weather at his destination. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something. Walter's hands. They were steady, precise. Not the hands of someone just going through the motions. The way he moved the scanner wand, the way he repositioned bags on the belt, the way he double-checked certain items without hesitation. It was practiced, disciplined, military. Marsh had served in the Air Force for 8 years before becoming a commercial pilot. He knew that posture, that focus, that discipline. It wasn't something you learned from a TSA training manual. It was something you earned. Marsh looked up, studied the man's face. Older, yes. Tired, maybe. But there was something in his posture. The way he stood, the way he held his shoulders. It was subtle, but it was there. And then Marsh saw it. Just beneath the collar of Walter's polo shirt, barely visible, was the edge of something metallic. A pin, a ribbon bar, faded but unmistakable. Marsh's breath caught. He leaned slightly to the side, trying to get a better look. Walter shifted, adjusting his collar without thinking. And for just a moment, less than 2 seconds, the pin became fully visible. It was blue, white stars, red and white stripes, the Medal of Honor. Marsh's entire body went rigid. His phone slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor, but he didn't move to pick it up. He just stood there, staring, his mind racing. The Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration, awarded for valor in combat, for actions above and beyond the call of duty. Fewer than 3,500 people had ever received it in the history of the United States. And one of them was standing 3 feet away, scanning luggage at an airport security checkpoint. Marsh didn't think. He just acted. He stepped forward, past the conveyor belt, past the scanner and came to a stop directly in front of Walter. Then, without a word, he snapped to attention. Heels together, back straight, arms at his sides, and he saluted. The checkpoint went silent. Not gradually, instantly. Every conversation stopped. Every passenger turned. Even the TSA agents on the other lanes looked over, confused. Walter froze. His hand hovered over the scanner. His eyes lifted slowly, meeting Marsh's. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then, quietly, Marsh said, "Sir, it's an honor." Walter blinked. His jaw tightened. He glanced down at his chest, realized what Marsh had seen, and then looked back up. He didn't say anything. He just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. But Marsh didn't move. He held the salute. Firm, respectful, unwavering. And then, slowly, other people began to notice. A woman in line whispered to her husband. A TSA agent leaned over to another. A businessman who had been complaining 5 minutes earlier stopped mid-scroll on his phone. One by one, people turned to look at Walter. Not with impatience, not with frustration, with respect. Walter's hand trembled slightly. He wasn't used to this. He hadn't worn that pin in public in years. He'd kept it tucked away, hidden beneath his uniform, because he didn't want the questions, didn't want the attention, didn't want to be seen as someone special. He'd spent the last 50 years trying to be invisible, trying to blend in, trying to be just another face in the crowd, because that's what felt safe, that's what felt manageable. But now, standing in the middle of a crowded airport terminal with a pilot saluting him and dozens of people watching, invisibility was no longer an option. After what felt like an eternity, Marsh finally lowered his salute. But he didn't step away. He stayed right where he was, his voice low but clear. "Vietnam?" he asked. Walter hesitated. Then, quietly, "Yes, sir." "Army?" "Marines." "First Recon." Marsh's eyes widened slightly. "First Recon. Deep jungle operations. High-risk reconnaissance. Some of the most dangerous missions of the war." "How long did you serve?" 6 years. 66 to 72. Marsh nodded slowly. And after, Walter glanced around. People were still watching, listening. He wasn't used to this. He cleared his throat, came home, worked different jobs. Security, maintenance, whatever paid. He paused. "This place hired me 12 years ago. Decent benefits. Quiet work. Quiet work." Marsh repeated, almost to himself. He looked at the crowd behind him, at the passengers who had been complaining, rushing, dismissing this man as nothing more than a slowdown in their day. Then he turned back to Walter and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Sir, thank you for your service, for everything." Walter's expression didn't change, but his eyes softened just a little. "Just doing my job," he said quietly. "You've been doing it your whole life?" Marsh replied. There was a pause, a long, heavy pause, and then Walter said something he hadn't said out loud in decades. "I lost my team." Marsh didn't respond. He just waited. Walter's voice was low, almost a whisper. 1970. We were deep in Laos. Reconnaissance mission. No support. No backup. Just 8 of us. He paused, his hands gripping the edge of the scanner table. We got ambushed, pinned down for 2 days. I was the only one who made it out. The checkpoint was completely silent now. No one moved. No one spoke. I carried 2 of them, Walter continued. As far as I could, but I couldn't get them all. I had to leave them. His voice cracked slightly. I had to leave them. Marsh's jaw tightened. He didn't know what to say. There was nothing to say. Walter took a breath, steadied himself. They gave me this, he said, gesturing vaguely to the pin beneath his collar. For surviving, for doing what anyone else would have done. He looked up at Marsh. But I didn't deserve it. I left them there. Marsh shook his head. So, with respect, you did what you had to do. You survived, and you've carried them ever since. Walter didn't respond. He just looked down at the scanner, his hands resting on the table, and for a moment, it seemed like he was somewhere else. Somewhere far away. Then, slowly, he looked back up. Thank you, he said quietly. Marsh nodded. Then he stepped back, picked up his bag, and walked toward his gate. But before he left, he stopped at the checkpoint supervisor's desk and said something quietly. The supervisor, a younger man named Eric, frowned at first. Then his eyes widened. He looked over at Walter, then back at Marsh, and nodded. 10 minutes later, Eric approached Walter during a shift change. He didn't say much, just asked him to come to the break room for a moment. Walter, confused, followed. Inside, the entire TSA team was waiting. 12 agents, all standing, all silent. Eric stepped forward and cleared his throat. Walter, he said, we just found out about your service, about everything. Walter said nothing. Eric continued. We didn't know, and we should have. Not because you needed to tell us, but because we should have asked. We should have noticed. He glanced at the others, then back at Walter. We are sorry for not seeing you, for not appreciating what you've done. For this country, for us. Walter looked at the floor, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't know what to say. Then, one by one, each agent stepped forward, and each one shook his hand. No speeches, no applause, just respect, quiet, genuine, earned. One of the younger agents, a man named Marcus who'd been working there for less than a year, stepped forward last. He was younger than the others, mid-20s, and he looked nervous. Sir, he said quietly, my grandfather served in Vietnam. He never talked about it. Not once. He paused. I wish I'd asked. Walter looked at him for a long moment. Then he placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. It's not too late, he said. Ask him now, while you still can. Marcus nodded, his eyes glistening slightly. I will, he said. Walter gave him a small smile. Then he turned and walked back to his post. The checkpoint resumed its normal rhythm after that. Passengers continued to rush. Bags continued to be scanned. Announcements continued to echo over the PA system. But something had changed. People noticed Walter now, not because he'd changed, but because they had. They saw him differently. They moved through his lane with a little more patience, a little more respect, a little more gratitude. Over the following days, word spread. Not on the news, not on social media, just quietly, person to person, the way important things used to spread. Passengers started recognizing him. Some would nod as they passed. Others would shake his hand. A few would stop and say, simply, thank you. One morning, a week after the incident, an older man approached Walter's lane. He was in his 70s, wearing a Vietnam veteran cap. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, looking at Walter. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small coin. It was a challenge coin, worn and faded, with a Marine Corps emblem on one side. He placed it gently on the scanner table. "For you," the man said quietly. From one Marine to another, Walter stayed the coin for a long moment. Then he looked up at the man. "Where did you serve?" he asked. "Da Nang, 68 to 69. Walter nodded slowly. "1st Marine Division." The man's eyes widened slightly. "You?" "1st Recon." The man let out a slow breath. Then he extended his hand. "It was an honor to serve with men like you." Walter shook his hand. "The honor was ours." The man nodded, picked up his bag, and walked away. But the coin remained on the table. Walter picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and then slipped it into his pocket. That night, when he got home to his small apartment, he placed the coin on his dresser, next to a faded photograph of 8 young men in jungle fatigues, arms slung over each other's shoulders, smiling despite the mud and exhaustion. He stared at the photo for a long time. Then he said, quietly, "I'm still here, boys. I'm still here." The following week, something unexpected happened. Walter arrived at work at his usual time, 4:15 a.m., and found a note taped to his locker. It was handwritten on plain white paper, and it read, "Thank you for your service. My father was a Marine in Vietnam. He didn't make it home, but men like you did, and that matters." There was no signature, just a note. Walter folded it carefully and placed it in his wallet. Over the next few weeks, more notes appeared. Some were from veterans. Some were from family members of veterans. Some were from people who simply wanted to say thank you. Walter kept every single one. He didn't respond to any of them. He didn't need to. The messages themselves were enough. One afternoon, a young woman approached his lane. She was in her early 20s, traveling alone, carrying a small backpack. She placed a bag on the belt, then hesitated. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "Are you Walter Hayes?" Walter looked up, surprised. "Yes." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "My grandfather," she said. "He served with you. In Laos, 1970. Walter's breath caught. He set down the scanner wand. "What was his name?" she asked. "Corporal James Mitchell." Walter's hands went still. He stared at her, his mind racing back 50 years. To a jungle clearing. To gunfire. To a young man with a wide grin and a terrible sense of humor who'd save his life more times than he could count. "Jimmy," Walter whispered. The woman nodded, tears streaming down her face. "He talked about you. Not often, but sometimes, when he thought I wasn't listening, he'd mention a guy named Hayes. He said you were the bravest man he ever knew." Walter shook his head slowly. "Jimmy was the brave one. He pulled me out of an ambush. Took a bullet doing it." The woman wiped her eyes. "He never told me that." Walter looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "He made it home, didn't he?" The woman nodded. "He did. He lived until 2018. Had a family. Grandkids. A good life." Walter's eyes glistened. "I'm glad." The woman reached in her bag and pulled out a photograph. It was old, creased, faded. It showed a young man in uniform, smiling at the camera. She handed it to Walter. "He wanted you to have this, if I ever found you." Walter took the photograph with trembling hands. He stared at it, his vision blurring. "Thank you," he whispered. The woman nodded. Then she picked up a bag and walked away, leaving Walter standing alone at the checkpoint, holding the photograph of a man he thought he'd never see again. That night, Walter placed the photograph on his dresser next to the challenge coin and the picture of his team. And for the first time in 50 years, he didn't feel alone. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, quietly, Walter's story spread beyond the airport. A local news station picked it up, then a national outlet, then a veterans organization. People wanted to interview him, to honor him, to tell his story. But Walter declined every request. He didn't want the attention. He didn't want the spotlight. He just wanted to do his job. But the recognition came anyway. One morning, he arrived at work to find a small ceremony waiting for him. Airport staff, TSA agents, a few veterans groups, and Captain David Marsh, the pilot who'd saluted him that day. They presented Walter with a plaque. It read, "In honor of Walter Hayes, Marine, hero, quiet guardian, thank you for your service." Walter stood there, surrounded by people holding the plaque, and for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to feel something he'd buried long ago. Pride. Not pride in the medal, not pride in the recognition, but pride in the fact that he'd survived, that he'd carried on, that he'd honored his team by living the life they never got to live. He looked out the faces around him and said, simply, "Thank you." And then he went back to work, because that's what he did. That's who he was. Some people teach by speaking. Others teach by presence. Walter Hayes never told his story unless someone asked. He never sought recognition. He never demanded respect. He just showed up, did his job, and let his actions speak for themselves. That's what real heroes do. They don't announce themselves. They don't demand attention. They just serve, quietly, honorably, until someone is paying close enough attention to see who they really are. Captain David Marsh was paying attention that day, and because of that, an entire airport learned what it means to honor those who never ask for it. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone like Walter Hayes? Someone who served, who sacrificed, who carried history in silence. Someone the world overlooked until one person stopped and truly saw them. Write their name in the comments. Tell their story. Say the words they never would. Because stories like this remind us that heroes don't always wear their medals. Sometimes they wear uniforms we overlook. Sometimes they scan our bags at security checkpoints. Sometimes they're standing right in front of us, and we don't even notice. Until someone does. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe, share it. Help us make sure people like Walter are never invisible again. We'll see you in the next one. And until then, if you see someone quietly doing their job, someone who moves with discipline and purpose, someone who carries themselves with quiet dignity, take a moment. Look closer, because you might be standing next to someone who changed the world, and they'll never tell you about it.